Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are wrestling with what I think is one of the great paradoxes of modern international relations.
Yeah, absolutely.
The decades-long conflict between China and Japan over their shared and very traumatic history. Our mission here is to understand why the memory of the 1937-1945 war, a war with just staggering casualties, didn't actually explode into a major political flashpoint until the early 1980s.
Right. That's nearly 4 decades after the conflict ended.
Exactly.
It's a classic case that just seems to defy common sense. You'd naturally assume that time, combined with massive economic investment, shared regional interests, constant social exchange, all of that would gradually soften historical resentment.
It should, right?
It should. But what we see instead is the complete opposite. A sudden, sharp escalation starting in the 80s that has, fundamentally poisoned Sino-Japanese political relations ever since. It's become a perpetual source of friction.
And we can trace the intensity of that friction to a very specific, highly charged flashpoint. I'm thinking of the annual visits by then Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro to the Yasukuni Shrine. That started in 2001.
A huge moment.
For context, this is a shrine dedicated to the spirits of those who died fighting for the Japanese emperor. But critically, and this is the key point, since 1978, it has enshrined class A war criminals from World War II.
And that single decision, the enshrinement of the Class A criminals, it fundamentally changed the shrine's status. It went from a site of, let's say, general remembrance to a symbol of historical revisionism, at least in the eyes of Beijing and Seoul.
So when Koizumi began his visits, claiming they were rooted in, I think the quote was, heartfelt repentance and condolences, and a pledge for peace.
Beijing saw pure provocation.
They didn't mince words.
Not at all. Beijing immediately condemned the visit as an erroneous act that has damaged the political foundation of Sino-Japanese relations as well as the feelings of the Chinese people.
And Koizumi just kept going,
Yeah.
annually until 2006.
He did. And the sources are really clear on this. During that time, bilateral relations plunged to their absolute lowest point since diplomatic normalization in 1972. It just highlights the immediate destructive power of this history issue when it's activated at the highest political level.
So the central mystery remains. Why did this potent, politically weaponized history issue lie dormant for so long, from the late 40s through the 70s, only to ignite so violently after 1982?
The answer, according to the sources we've looked at, is fascinatingly cynical.
I think that's the right word for it.
The core argument is this. International political conflict over history is fundamentally caused by the intentional, calculated manipulation of history by ruling elites.
We're calling it national myth-making.
Right, national myth-making for purely instrumental purposes. And these disputes, they're typically only exploited when that ruling class feels deeply insecure domestically.
So when they're facing internal challenges, things like questions of regime legitimacy, internal factional struggles, or maybe the urgent need for mass social mobilization.
Exactly. History becomes a powerful, readily available tool. We're sort of moving away from this idea that genuine, raw historical emotion is what spontaneously drives policy.
And more toward a model where political leaders are consciously using historical grievances as a pragmatic instrument for political survival.
It's important for you to remember that this is a story of reconstruction, not just recollection.
Right.
So today we're going to unpack that shift. From the strategic silence of the 1950s and 60s, which both sides benefited from, to the aggressive disputes of the post-1982 era. And we're going to focus entirely on the internal domestic pressures that force both nations to weaponize memory.
Okay, let's start with that period of silence, the first 3 decades after the war. It's so crucial to understand that even when the history issue was politically quiet, both ruling elites were deeply engaged in shaping and institutionalizing national myths that serve their immediate political needs. Let's begin with Japan.
Okay.
What was the conservative ruling group's objective right after the war, and how did they use historical revisionism to achieve it?
Their objective was pure political preservation. Self-whitewashing. The post-war conservative establishment, who later formed the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, they were heavily connected to and frankly complicit in the wartime regime.
So they needed to clean up their image.
Desperately. They had to cleanse their reputation and distance themselves from accountability to regain and, maintain power. And they did this through the creation and the very effective institutionalization of 3 major historical myths.
And these myths worked because they happened to align with the geopolitical realities of the time, specifically the U.S. strategy in the Cold War, right?
Precisely. The U.S. needed a stable, anti-communist, conservative government in Japan. It was supposed to be a bulwark against Soviet expansionism in Asia.
A strategic asset.
A vital one. And this geopolitical priority meant the U.S. tolerated, and often, tacitly supported, the conservative attempt to define the war in a way that preserved their political structure.
So let's get into these three foundational myths that really came to define Japan's post-war identity.
The first, and you could argue the most crucial for their political survival, was the myth of the military clique.
Okay.
This narrative argued that the war was not the responsibility of the nation or even the wider ruling class, but that it was initiated solely by a small, isolated group of fanatical military leaders.
That sounds incredibly convenient. It's a classic move, isn't it? Blame the extreme few to exonerate the responsible many.
It was more than convenient. It was essential for the LDP's future. By focusing the blame so narrowly on this military clique, the myth effectively whitewashed the complicity of critical non-military actors.
Like who?
Well, the emperor, court officials, the high-ranking bureaucrats who ran the civilian administration, and especially the zaibatsu, the giant industrial and financial conglomerates that funded and profited immensely from the war effort.
And these were the very groups that formed the base of the LDP.
These very groups provided the human capital and the financial base for the LDP's post-war conservative dominance.
So by institutionalizing this one myth, they stabilized the entire political system and made sure that the individuals and institutions providing post-war stability, even if they were wartime collaborators, were insulated from accountability.
Exactly. The second key myth was the Western-centric myth. This one acknowledged Japan's responsibility for opening hostilities, but critically only against the Western allies.
The U.S. and Britain.
The U.S. and Britain. By focusing entirely on Pearl Harbor and the Pacific Campaign, Japanese memory conveniently evaded the entire history of aggression and the horrendous atrocities committed against Asian nations, particularly China and Korea.
Why was it so vital for them to evade that Asian dimension?
Because a thorough, honest investigation into Asian war crimes would have revealed a level of widespread complicity far beyond that narrow military clique.
It would have implicated so many more people.
It would have implicated soldiers, lower-level officers, civilian administrators in occupied territories, and numerous others. It would have shown a societal complicity that would have completely delegitimized the conservative political structure they were trying so hard to rebuild.
And then there was the third myth.
Yeah.
The glorification of the common soldier.
The heroic sacrifice myth.
Yeah.
This narrative extolled the image of imperial soldiers who sacrificed themselves for the nation. By focusing on the soldier as a martyr, a hero who died for the collective good, conservative historiography completely bypassed any discussion of the failures of war policy.
The reasons for the war itself.
Or, most importantly, the systematic war crimes and atrocities committed by the military rank and file all across Asia.
The genius of it, or perhaps the cynicism, is that these three myths allowed Japan to see itself primarily as a victim.
Yes.
A victim of the atomic bombs, of the military clique, of the war's end, rather than a perpetrator of aggression in Asia. And this memory, it resonated with the Japanese public that was struggling with its own immense post-war suffering.
It worked. These narratives became entrenched, institutionalized, and that made it incredibly difficult later for anyone, whether it was domestic reformers or foreign governments, to challenge this core historical consensus without being seen as unpatriotic or as challenging the very foundations of the post-war state.
Okay, so now let's look at the other side of this strategic silence. China. China had every reason for outrage, yet for decades, Beijing actively avoided using war history as a political weapon against Japan. What was their core strategy after 1949?
China's strategy was dictated entirely by the Cold War. After the PRC was established in 1949, the paramount goal was political survival and national consolidation. So the central theme of Chinese grand strategy was counterbalancing American imperialism.
Driven by the U.S. containment policy and its support for the KMT in Taiwan.
Exactly. The U.S. was the primary geopolitical adversary.
Okay, so given that Japan was so firmly cemented into the U.S. security architecture, they should have been the second enemy. But China took a very, very different path.
They needed to drive a wedge into the U.S.-Japan alliance. To do that, Beijing used a highly pragmatic strategy they called people's diplomacy. The goal was to woo Japanese society, foster pro-PRC sentiment, and ultimately pressure Tokyo to shift its diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing.
And that required a specific, non-demonizing historical narrative.
Absolutely. The official Chinese history refrained from demonizing the entire Japanese nation. Instead, it very carefully separated the small handful of Japanese militarists who were the true villains from the vast majority of ordinary Japanese people
Who they framed as fellow victims.
as fellow victims of those same militarists. In this rhetoric, it aligned perfectly with communist, class-based ideology, which emphasized that the workers and peasants of Japan were allies, not enemies, of the Chinese people.
That moderate tone was so clearly instrumental, designed to create a favorable impression inside Japan and facilitate strategic goals. But this calculus also led to some staggering domestic omissions regarding the true extent of Japanese atrocities.
The omissions were profound. Domestically, Beijing actively suppressed historical investigation and public discussion of Japanese war crimes. Official war movies, for instance, they systematically avoided elaborating on the horrors of the Japanese occupation.
And what was the party line on why?
The reasoning from the party elite was chillingly pragmatic. They feared that focusing on the emotional details of mass suffering would be seen as disseminating sentimentalism and capitalist humanitarianism, which they believed would dilute our hatred of imperialism.
Meaning it would confuse the primary ideological target, which was the U.S., not a potential Japanese partner.
That's right. It's a powerful illustration of history being silenced for ideological and strategic gain. But the clearest proof of this strategic prioritization lies in China's unprecedented leniency toward war criminals and its decision on reparations.
This is the definitive evidence of the strategic silence, isn't it?
It is. Let's look at the roughly 1,000 Japanese war criminals detained by the PRC after 1949. Contrast this with other post-war trials globally. Of that 1,000, only 45 were sentenced to prison.
And
Crucially, none were executed or given life sentences. The vast majority were pardoned, treated relatively leniently, and quickly sent back to Japan.
that level of leniency is almost unimaginable, given the scale of the atrocities committed in China. It just shows that they prioritize diplomatic relations and future alignment over immediate justice and historical accountability.
It speaks volumes. And this trajectory all culminated in the 1972 diplomatic normalization, which was driven by critical geostrategic desperation. By the late 1960s, the Sino-Soviet split had gotten dramatically worse.
So now China faced not only the U.S., but also a hostile, nuclear-armed Soviet Union to its north.
A far more immediate threat. Beijing desperately needed a geopolitical partner in East Asia.
So the U.S. enemy suddenly became a secondary concern, and Japan became a vital counterweight to Soviet hegemonism.
Exactly. Premier Zhu Enlai, recognizing this strategic need, offered the ultimate concession to renounce war reparations entirely. Beijing had already made the internal decision back in the 60s to forego any future claims.
And that was a massive political sacrifice. We're talking tens of billions of dollars at the time.
A huge sum. But it paved the way for immediate normalization.
And what did China get in terms of an apology for this enormous concession?
They got Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue's highly ambiguous reference to Japan's responsibility for an unfortunate period and a statement of deep reflection.
So, intentionally vague, it fell far short of a formal apology for aggression.
Very far short. But Beijing, prioritizing the strategic necessity of the moment, quickly accepted this minimalist gesture in exchange for official recognition. They reiterated their agreement with Japan's myth of the military clique and avoided any substantial political dispute over history throughout the entire 1970s.
So for 30 years, the history issue was a non-issue because both ruling elites had powerful internal reasons to keep that issue locked away. So now we turn to the dramatic break. What fundamental changes happened in China in the early 1980s that made the history issue suddenly essential for the ruling elite?
This is where the core thesis of instrumentalization really comes into sharp focus. The theory suggests that elites only weaponize history when they're confronting an intense sense of domestic insecurity, be it a challenge to their power or a fundamental threat to national cohesion. And for China, the post-Mao era was defined by exactly that kind of internal crisis.
Okay, let's unpack the political tightrope Deng Xiaoping was walking. He had launched this crucial shift toward economic modernization, opening China up after the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. But that shift itself was politically precarious and generated enormous internal instability.
Deng had dual goals. First, he had to restore public faith in the party after the devastation of the Cultural Revolution. And second, he had to consolidate his own power by sidelining Maoist hardliners and cementing his reforms. But both of those goals were immediately challenged by a mounting social and ideological crisis.
What were the specific signs of this social discontent that was threatening the party's control?
The sources detail some really intense pressure points. Economically, rapid changes led to high unemployment among the sent-down youths returning to cities, inflation, growing official corruption. Politically, you had the Democracy Wall campaign questioning the very nature of Communist Party leadership. Socially, there was widespread disillusionment and a rising crime rate.
A total crisis.
So much so that General Secretary Hu Yaobang admitted the party faced a threefold crisis of faith, belief, and trust in 1980.
That admission is a clear signal of a full-blown crisis of regime legitimacy. The public trust had just evaporated.
Yeah.
But on top of the social crisis, Deng was also facing a brutal internal battle for control over the party's direction.
And this internal cleavage was maybe the most dangerous threat of all. On one side, you had the reformists, led by Deng, pushing for economic liberalization and openness. On the other, you had the powerful economic and ideological conservatives, veteran cadres, senior military leaders, people like Chen Yun who deeply distrusted this openness.
They saw the social disorder and the democracy movement as proof that dangerous Western liberal ideas were destroying China.
Exactly. The conservatives were constantly looking for leverage to attack Deng's reform agenda, claiming it was leading to moral decay and political instability.
So Deng needed to placate these hardliners to maintain stability, but he also needed to re-legitimize the party in the eyes of a disillusioned public.
Precisely. And this created a profound need for an external adversary, an ideological foil that could unify the fractured leadership and the disgruntled masses.
And this is where Japan, conveniently categorized as a Western country aligned with the U.S., became the perfect solution. So how did adopting a tough stance on history solve Deng's multifaceted internal problems?
It was a masterstroke of political calculation. Adopting a tough, uncompromising stance on Japanese historical amnesia achieved three crucial objectives at once. First, it appeased the party conservatives. It proved that Deng, despite his economic openness, was still a staunch defender of national pride and revolutionary integrity.
It was a way to say, we may be doing business with the West, but we are not becoming the West.
Exactly right. Secondly, it powerfully restored Deng's own prestige and the party's legitimacy in the eyes of the general public. By standing up forcefully against the historic aggressor and defending Chinese victimhood, the party presented itself once again as the sole, indispensable protector of the nation's honor. It helped rebuild that lost faith, belief, and trust.
And the third objective speaks directly to the social crisis deflecting public anger.
Yes, and most importantly, it provided a massive national focus that deflected public resentment over domestic problems, corruption, inflation, inequality away from the government, and onto a convenient external adversary. By depicting Japan as an immoral other, the government restored internal cohesion. It was a cold, calculated move for internal political survival.
So the necessary conditions are in place. The Chinese elite needs a political tool, and Japan provides the opportunity. This leads us directly to the ignition point in 1982, the Japanese textbook controversy, where conservative myth-making in Japan met strategic instrumentalization in China.
And we have to understand that the 1982 controversy was not a sudden accident. It was the culmination of years of intentional effort by Japanese conservative elites who felt their post-war self-whitewashing was being eroded by more moderate elements.
They felt the textbooks were becoming too masochistic, reflecting too much of the Asian victimization narrative.
Exactly. Starting around 1980, these conservatives within the LDP launched what they called the Biased Textbooks Campaign. They actively sought to tighten the Ministry of Education's control over the textbook authorization system, specifically targeting any coverage of Asian war suffering that they deemed leftist or damaging to the national spirit.
So the LDP was engaged in its own proactive myth-making to push a more self-glorifying patriotic view of the war at home.
Absolutely. The LDP passed internal resolutions saying that school education should proactively cultivate the Japanese spirit and foster national pride. And this political momentum culminated in January 1982 when the education minister, Tanaka Tatsuo, explicitly instructed textbook writers to soften their approach to Japan's excesses during World War II.
And then came the specific linguistic change that became the international catalyst. This wasn't just about changing a paragraph. It was about shifting the semantic definition of the war itself.
That's the core of it. The key linguistic change that ignited the storm was the media report that Mambusho, the Ministry of Education, had instructed textbook authors to replace the strong term shinraku.
Which means invasion or aggression.
Right. And they were told to replace it with the neutral, sanitized term shinshutsu.
Meaning advance or move forward.
when describing Japan's actions in China.
Let's just pause on the power of those two words. Shinrikyo carries the full moral weight of imperial aggression. Shinshutsu suggests a commercial expansion, an official journey. It just completely strips away the culpability.
The semantic difference is monumental. For China and for South Korea, too, this was interpreted as official Japanese government confirmation that Tokyo was attempting a fundamental government-sanctioned whitewashing of history.
A betrayal of the 1972 normalization agreements. The news broke globally at the end of June 1982, sparking condemnation. But here is the critical strategic twist. If Beijing was so outraged, why did the official Chinese media wait nearly a full month to launch its coordinated attack on Japan?
That month-long delay was highly deliberate and strategic. And it takes us right back to Deng Xiaoping's domestic calculations. The controversy broke shortly before the 12th Party Congress in September 1982, a critical, high-stakes meeting where Deng was trying to consolidate his reformist power base.
So if Deng had responded too quickly or compromised with Japan, he would have given immediate ammunition to the conservative hardliners.
They would have accused him of being soft-kneed, of prioritizing foreign relations over national honor, of confirming their fears that his economic openness was leading to ideological weakness. Deng would have been politically vulnerable.
So by waiting and then launching a strategically coordinated hardline media attack on Japan just before the Congress,
he proved his uncompromising patriotic credentials.
the intensity of the attack on Japan was directly proportional to the intensity of Deng's internal political battle. The history dispute was a sacrificial lamb offered up to ensure the survival of his economic reform agenda.
It was a classic instrumental maneuver. The strong response shored up Deng's prestige and bought him political capital with the skeptical military and veteran cadres whose support he needed. The dispute was a product of factional politics first, historical remembrance second.
And this successful instrumentalization, where Beijing realized just how useful the history issue was as a domestic tool, it set a dangerous precedent. The disputes kept escalating throughout the 80s.
The tool had proven its worth. In 1985, Chinese university students, already sensitive to official nationalist cues, openly protested Prime Minister Nakasone's Yasukuni visit. And then in 1986, during another textbook controversy, Beijing demonstrated its increased confidence by successfully pressuring the Nakasone government to revise a nationalistic textbook, and even got the education minister fired.
Fujio Masayuki.
That's him. So the history issue was now fully politicized, weaponized, and established as the primary leverage point in bilateral relations.
And the success of this strategy led directly to the next phase, the institutionalization of conflict through China's nationwide patriotic education campaign after the 1989 Tiananmen Square crisis.
The Tiananmen crisis severely exacerbated the CCP's existing legitimacy problem. The years after saw the party's prestige just tumble, fueled by rising social inequality, the continued scourge of cadre corruption, and a massive loss of faith in communist ideology itself, especially among the younger generation.
So if communism was failing as the foundation for the party's right to rule, they needed a powerful replacement ideology to ensure mass loyalty and intra-party unity.
And that replacement was Aiguazui patriotism. The government performed this crucial ideological pivot. They formally promoted assertive nationalism to facilitate intra-party consolidation and strengthen regime legitimacy.
And it worked because patriotism is more visceral than abstract theory.
Exactly. Unlike communist theory, patriotic ideas wrapped in narratives of national pride, collective victimhood, and hostility toward historic aggressors are perceived by the public as fundamentally true.
And Japan, the recent invader with a documented history of historical revisionism, became the ideal target for this new state-sponsored assertive nationalism.
The perfect target. By taking an extremely harsh, uncompromising position on the Japanese history issue, Beijing successfully conveyed to its domestic audience that it would never compromise national interests, especially with the West or its allies. It allowed the government to be economically moderate, they still needed Western investment, while being ideologically rigid.
And this wasn't just political rhetoric. It was institutionalized through a systematic, multi-generational program. What was the framework of this patriotic education campaign?
The PEC began structurally with the resumption of Five-Love education in 1985, but it was formally enshrined in 1994 with the publication of the Outline for the Implementation of Patriotic Education. And this framework systematically overhauled the entire educational and commemorative landscape.
What was the primary narrative focus?
The campaign emphasized the shared national experience of resisting foreign aggression as a means of achieving collective suffering and eventual glory. And critically, out of China's long 100-year history of struggle against various foreign powers, the 1937-45 war against Japan was singled out and elevated as the single most important military conflict.
Why that war specifically?
Because the party could frame it as China's first complete victory against foreign invaders in modern history. This supported the narrative of national renewal and resilience, and it directly linked the CCP's leadership to the ultimate triumph of the nation. The history served as the indispensable anchor for the CCP's legitimacy.
And this institutional shift necessitated a complete revision of internal historical memory, getting rid of the old ideological strictures of the Mao era.
Major revisions were necessary. For decades, the communist narrative had downplayed or ignored the role of their rivals, the KMT, in the war. Now, the old class struggle narrative was just jettisoned. For the first time, textbooks began including details of KMT-led military campaigns, like in the famous 1986 movie The Bloody Battle of Taerswang.
And that inclusion wasn't just about historical accuracy. It had instrumental political value relating to Taiwan.
It was crucial for national unification goals. By acknowledging the KMT's role in resisting Japan, Beijing was building a shared national heritage that could potentially appeal to the anti-independence constituency in Taiwan, furthering the goal of a single China.
So the history was mobilized to serve contemporary geopolitics.
And at the same time, the official strategic cover-up of Japanese war crimes from the 50s was reversed and replaced with comprehensive, often gruesome, documentation.
The shift was stark.
Very. Textbooks now provided extensive, detailed, and visually explicit coverage of Japanese atrocities, statistics on fatalities, harrowing pictures, comprehensive coverage of chemical warfare, and the brutal human experiments of Unit 731. The purpose was clear: the active demonization of the aggressor.
And this demonization was solidified physically through monumental commemorative sites, the icon of which became the Nanjing Massacre Memorial.
The Nanjing Memorial, completed in August 1985, became the enduring icon of Chinese war victimhood. Its architecture and inscriptions are deliberately designed to instill maximum emotional impact and a political lesson. The front wall clearly states the official death toll: victims 300,000.
And that number is not just a statistic, it's an official political declaration.
It is. And the inner wall of the memorial carries the powerful, unforgettable command to never forget national humiliation, Wuang Guji. The site is designed to function not merely as a museum, but as a place of political pilgrimage, where the narrative of victimization and the need for a strong party protector are viscerally renewed.
So the new narrative successfully corrected the historical cover-up of atrocities, but its ultimate mythological function was to arouse extreme victimhood, rigidly demonize Japan, and crucially deflect scrutiny from sensitive issues that might hurt the party's prestige, like the party's own historical failings.
It established a powerful, non-negotiable narrative framework for the entire nation, systematically training generations of citizens to view that conflict as the defining narrative of national survival and triumph, with the CCP as its essential guardian.
And now we see how this top-down campaign, once it's institutionalized, filters into the public sphere and begins to generate its own uncontrollable momentum. This takes us to the crucial feedback loop, where elite manipulation creates bottom-up radicalization.
The patriotic education campaign was met with immense receptivity, largely because it finally validated these deeply embedded private memories and historical resentments that had been suppressed by the class hatred narrative of the Mao era.
The public, especially the urban population, the captive audience, was starved of the documented truth about Japanese war crimes for decades. When the information was finally sanctioned by the party, it poured into a vacuum of historical knowledge.
The public hunger was undeniable. When a PLA publisher released a book called The Great Nanjing Massacre in 1987, it sold 150,000 copies in the first month and needed immediate reprints. Patriotic sentiment quickly moved beyond the control of party propagandists.
Nationalism became the prevailing public consensus.
It did. It was embraced by popular culture, academics, and critically the burgeoning, newly available digital sphere.
But this top-down promotion of patriotic emotion had an unintended, radicalizing consequence. It engendered an extreme form of anti-Thurnism that soon became difficult for the ruling elite to manage.
This is the radicalization feedback loop in action. When patriotism is the defining measure of loyalty, people, politicians, and citizens start competing to be the most ardent patriots. While the official discourse still trying to maintain the distinction between Japanese militarists and ordinary Japanese people, the public, inflamed by these detailed accounts of suffering and humiliation, increasingly ignored those fine distinctions, condemning the entire nation as evil.
And this radicalism found a powerful platform in the rise of the internet, leading to the phenomenon of fenking culture.
Fenking, the indignant young people, used the newly liberalized cyberspace, especially internet bulletin boards post-1990s, to launch unbridled xenophobic insults against Japan and its culture. Critically, they also targeted fellow Chinese citizens deemed Hanjian traitors who were associated with Japan.
The sources provide a jarring example of this virulence.
The 2001 attack on a famous Chinese actress is a perfect illustration. She was publicly attacked, verbally and physically, simply for wearing a dress in a fashion shoot that vaguely resembled the design of the old Japanese military flag.
And it got worse.
Her assailants, driven by this highly emotional, radicalized nationalism, later assaulted her with human waste. This constituency of fenking became a powerful, highly vocal force demanding uncompromising, hardline anti-Japanese policies.
And this intense bottom-up pressure in China coincides with the backlash in Japan. Japanese government attempts at historical compromise were fueling their own neo-nationalist reaction.
Japanese leaders, reacting to external pressure, had made some concessions like increasing textbook coverage of Asian victimization. But this provoked a severe backlash among Japanese right-wing and neo-nationalist groups who aggressively opposed what they labeled masochistic views of history.
So groups dedicated to advancing a self-glorifying history became highly active, culminating in the controversial 2001 approval of the revisionist New History textbook.
This was a dangerous dynamic. The intense contestation in Japan was instantly relayed by the liberalized Chinese media to an already inflamed Chinese public, confirming their narrative that Japan was trying to completely revise history. The gap between the two nations' historical memories, amplified by both countries' domestic politics, was starkly exposed.
And this convergence set the stage for the Koizumi flashpoint, making his annual Yasukuni visits from 2001 to 2006 the ultimate political and diplomatic insult.
Koizumi's visits were undeniably aimed at domestic political gains, fostering Japanese national pride, advancing a post-Cold War normal state mentality. But to China, the message was clear. Because the shrine had enshrined class of war criminals since 1978, and the associated Yushuken Military Museum actively glorified the war as the Greater East Asian War.
His visits were seen as an official validation of imperial aggression.
Exactly. The political damage was immediate. Bilateral relations plummeted to their lowest point since normalization, and the public outrage peaked in that intense, often destructive anti-Japanese mass campaign of April 2005.
Facing this overwhelming public rage, Chinese leaders felt compelled to adopt an uncompromising stance, and this created Beijing's ultimate predicament.
It did. They desperately needed to protect vital economic ties with Japan, which were crucial for technology and investment. But they absolutely could not afford to be seen by the public or by internal party rivals as soft-kneed by clamping down on popular nationalism.
The nationalism they had cultivated for internal gain was now restricting their foreign policy options.
Exactly. The result was the diplomatic freeze. In 2002, China decided to suspend exchanges of leaders' visits with Koizumi. Both the former leader Jiang Zemin and his successor Hu Jintao were trapped by the system they had helped create.
They were political prisoners of it.
They were. Hu, still consolidating his own power, relied heavily on support from various party factions, including Jiang Zemin's remaining power base. Backing down from the harsh stance, the demand for a halt to Yasukuni visits was simply politically too costly.
They became prisoners of the hardline nationalism they had successfully instrumentalized years earlier. The leaders were forced to maintain the explicit linkage. No halt to Yasukuni visits. No resumption of high-level state visits.
It's a textbook case of political blowback. The conflict of memory ceased to be merely an intellectual or historical debate. It became structurally entrenched, driven by ongoing domestic political necessity and constantly reinforced by a highly sensitive, radicalized popular opinion, making diplomatic compromise incredibly difficult for both sides.
So this deep dive shows that the instrumentalization of history by ruling elites fundamentally transformed Sino-Japanese relations. Let's look at the lasting implications of this history war in the early 21st century.
The legacy continues to fuel bilateral tensions across multiple domains, far beyond textbooks and shrines. Textbook controversies are still a recurrent, predictable issue. But the historical narrative is now interwoven with maritime and territorial disputes that are central to national security and resource claims.
For example, the disputes over the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, the East China Sea gas fields, the status of Okunotori Island. They're constantly framed in both countries through the lens of historical aggression and national defense.
These territorial issues are no longer just legal matters. They are imbued with the historical narrative of victimization and the sacred defense of the homeland. And the friction continues even in the small details of diplomatic communication.
The sources highlight a specific 2025 incident involving allegations of China's foreign ministry altering a Japanese prime minister's comments. Can you tell us what happened and why that's so revealing?
This alleged incident, where the Chinese press release claimed the Japanese PM expressed respect for China's articulated position, when the Japanese side protested that no such statement was ever made. It's fascinating. It demonstrates that the impulse for narrative control for myth-making is still active and necessary even at the highest diplomatic levels.
The desire to project a narrative of superiority.
Or compliance. And even through diplomatic channels, it often results in immediate international firestorms, further eroding trust.
And what has been the ultimate public impact of 2 decades of this heightened, instrumentalized conflict?
The public consciousness has fully absorbed the conflict. Trust has completely eroded. Surveys, like a major one from 2023, revealed just how effective this polarization has been. Approximately 90% of Japanese citizens now report having a negative impression of China.
90%.
An immense gulf. It demonstrates how historical instrumentalization has successfully hardened national identity and shattered the foundations of strategic trust established during the era of silence in the 1970s.
Okay, let's bring this back to the core insights for you, our listener. What are the key takeaways from this journey through instrumentalized memory?
First, understanding conflict over historical memory means realizing it is a process of reconstruction, constantly being reshaped by present political needs, not simply the honest recording of facts.
Both countries were doing it.
Both countries actively practiced historical suppression in the 50s and 60s for entirely different but equally self-serving strategic reasons.
Second, the dramatic shift from strategic silence to vociferous dispute after 1982 was not a historical inevitability. It was a strategic, calculated maneuver by the CCP ruling elites, specifically Deng Xiaoping, who urgently needed an ideological foil to counter deep domestic instability, social disillusionment, and intense factional tension within the party post-Mao.
And third, the institutionalization of this strategy through the patriotic education campaign, while top-down in origin, created a powerful bottom-up radicalization, the thinking culture. And this popular momentum became fiercely independent and eventually trapped subsequent leaders, like Hu Jintao, forcing them to maintain uncompromising hardline positions, like the Yasukuni summit freeze, even when compromise might have been strategically or economically preferable.
The core insight, then, is that international clashes of memory are profoundly difficult to resolve because ruling elites have such high domestic stakes in manipulating national history for their own political survival and legitimacy.
The stakes are the highest kind. The survival of the regime itself. The source material reminds us that Chinese elites have long used myth-making not just for foreign conflicts, but for internal history, too. For instance, tightly controlling the interpretation of the Boxer Uprising or the history of the CCP to legitimize their current rule.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to explore on your own. If the history issue is fundamentally about internal political survival and legitimacy, using an external opponent to deflect domestic issues, how might ongoing internal political debates or power struggles unrelated to Japan today, for example, severe economic slowdowns or new crackdowns on corruption, continue to necessitate and instrumentalize the history issue in Sino-Japanese relations, even if the current leaders in both countries genuinely prefer stability and compromise?
The historical antagonism is now so deeply integrated into the fabric of domestic politics that the tool of nationalism risks using the hands that wield it. When a political party's legitimacy depends on perpetuating a grievance, that grievance is unlikely to ever fully disappear. Think about that the next time you hear a historical statement from a political leader.
That is a powerful and very cynical observation. Thank you for guiding us through this incredibly deep dive into instrumentalized memory and political survival.